You ever have one of those days where you just want to sink into the cool, chlorinated embrace of your own private swimming pool, on your own private property? Maybe with a cold drink and absolutely zero human interaction, and then find yourself, not an hour later, officially informing your homeowners association president that she's under arrest for being a monumental idiot with a penchant for misusing emergency services. No? Well, pull up a chair, grab some popcorn, and drop a comment letting me know where you're watching from. Because this particular Saturday last July went from 0 to "you can't make this stuff up" faster than you can say frivolous 911 call. It's a crazy story, but every infuriating, ultimately satisfying word of it is true. I'd always dreamed of a house with a pool. Not some Olympic-sized monstrosity, just a pleasant, kidney-shaped oasis where I could float my cares away after a long week. My job, you see, can be demanding. It involves a lot of structure, a lot of rules, and occasionally dealing with people at their absolute worst. So, when I finally closed on a modest ranch-style house in what seemed like a quiet, well-kept suburban neighborhood, the in-ground pool in the backyard was the crown jewel. It wasn't just a pool, it was my planned sanctuary, my personal decompression chamber. I spent the first few weeks meticulously cleaning it, checking the pump, balancing the chemicals, the whole 9 yards. I even invested in a new, sturdy, 6-foot privacy fence, not because the old one was dilapidated, but because I truly valued the private part of private pool. A solid, lockable gate, a couple of tastefully placed private property, no trespassing, signs that were probably overkill but made me feel secure. I thought I'd covered all my bases. The neighborhood itself was pleasant enough. Tree-lined streets, manicured lawns, the kind of place where people wave as they retrieve their mail. The HOA, I'd been told, was mostly concerned with keeping the common areas tidy and ensuring nobody painted their house an offensive shade of puce. Standard stuff, or so I thought. My first proper introduction to the esteemed president of our HOA, one Mrs. Carol McMillan, though everyone just called her Karen behind her back, and soon you'll understand why, was less than auspicious. I was out front, wrestling a new hibiscus plant into submission near my mailbox, when she descended upon me. She wasn't walking. She was processing, like a royal reviewing the serfs. Carol was a woman who seemed permanently encased in expensive-looking linen outfits that always appeared one size too tight, as if perpetually holding her breath to maintain an air of rigid superiority. Her hair was a helmet of blonde ambition, sprayed to within an inch of its life, and her face was set in an expression of chronic, mild disapproval, as though the world constantly failed to meet her exacting standards. She drove a pristine, white Lexus SUV, the kind that's never seen a speck of mud, and usually piloted it through the neighborhood at about 5 miles per hour below the speed limit, eyes darting left and right, cataloging infractions. On this particular day, she'd parked it, slightly askew, across the street, and was now standing over me, a clipboard clutched to her chest like a shield. "Mr. Davies, is it?" she began, her voice a reedy soprano that could probably etch glass. I confirmed my identity, still grappling with the hibiscus. "I am Carol McMillan, president of the Oakhaven Estates Homeowners Association." She announced this as if it were a title of minor nobility. "I just wanted to personally welcome you to the neighborhood, and to remind you that our covenants require all new landscaping to be approved by the Architectural Review Committee." She tapped the clipboard. "I don't recall seeing a submission for that." She gestured vaguely at my struggling plant. I explained politely that it was a single hibiscus, hardly a structural alteration, but promised to look into the paperwork. She gave a curt nod, her eyes flicking over my yard with an appraising and frankly unsettling gaze, lingering for a moment on the top of my new privacy fence visible just over the roofline of my garage. "Yes, well, we like to maintain a certain standard here in Oakhaven," she sniffed, before turning on her heel and processing back to her Lexus. It was a minor interaction, easily dismissed, but it left a faint, unpleasant aftertaste, like accidentally swallowing pool water. A little warning bell, perhaps, that I initially ignored. I'd heard whispers, of course, from some of the more established, and therefore more jaded, neighbors. Old Mr. Henderson from across the street, a retired history teacher with a twinkle in his eye, had caught me one afternoon while I was edging my lawn. "Watch out for Carol," he'd murmured, cupping his hand conspiratorially. "Thinks that HOA badge makes her queen of all she surveys. Got a fine from my bird feeder last month. Unauthorized avian attraction structure, she called it." He chuckled, but there was a weariness there too. I'd nodded sympathetically, thinking it was probably a slight exaggeration. Everyone complains about their HOA, right? It's practically a national pastime. But I was beginning to suspect Mr. Henderson wasn't exaggerating by much. Over the next few weeks, I received a couple of delicately worded but unmistakably passive-aggressive notices via email from the HOA, presumably from Carol herself or one of her designated enablers on the board. One was about the precise placement of my trash and recycling bins on collection day. They were apparently 3 inches too close to the curb. Another was a friendly reminder that holiday decorations should not be erected more than 30 days prior to the holiday in question. This was in early June, and I hadn't even thought about the 4th of July yet. It was petty, annoying, but manageable. I complied, rolled my eyes in private, and focused on enjoying my house, and especially my pool. The day of the great pool confrontation dawned hot and sticky, one of those oppressive mid-July scorchers where the air itself feels like a damp wool blanket. I had the day off, a rare and precious commodity. My plan was simple: coffee, a light breakfast, then a long, uninterrupted session of aquatic lounging. I envisioned myself floating aimlessly, the sun on my face, SPF 50 naturally. The only sound, the gentle lapping of water against the sides of the pool. Bliss. Around 11, I was out back, arranging my towel on a lounger, the cicadas already buzzing their relentless summer song. The pool looked incredibly inviting, sparkling blue under the bright sun. My privacy fence stood tall and resolute, a silent guardian of my impending tranquility, or so I believed. I'd just dipped a toe in, testing the water, when I heard it, the distinctive high-pitched shrieks of children, followed by a louder, more commanding female voice. My stomach gave a little lurch. I knew that voice. Peering through a tiny gap in the fence boards near the gate, I saw Carol McMillan, resplendent in a vibrant, possibly flammable floral caftan, standing on the sidewalk just outside my property line. With her were 2 children, a boy and a girl, probably around 8 and 10, both looking flushed and whiny. They were bouncing impatiently, pointing towards my backyard, more specifically, towards my pool. Carol had her hands on her hips, an expression of stern maternalism mixed with that familiar air of entitlement. "Now, children, just be patient," she was saying, though not in a particularly patient tone. "Mrs. Albright next door said Mr. Davies has a lovely pool, and it's far too hot for you to just be running about." My blood pressure took a little unsolicited vacation to a higher elevation. Mrs. Albright, bless her gossipy heart, probably meant well, but she'd unwittingly painted a target on my sanctuary. I ducked back from the fence, heart thumping. Surely not. Surely she wouldn't be so audacious as to assume. But then I heard the distinct click-clack of her wedge sandals on my driveway, followed by a series of insistent, rhythmic knocks on my locked pool gate. Not my front door, mind you, my pool gate, the one clearly marked private property. I took a deep breath, telling myself to remain calm, polite, but firm. This was my castle, and she was, quite literally, at the gates. I walked over, my bare feet patting softly on the cool concrete of the pool deck, and unlatched the gate, opening it just enough to see her face. Up close, her makeup was a formidable bastion against the humidity, and her perfume, a cloying floral concoction, wafted aggressively towards me. Her 2 children, sweaty and red-faced, peered around her legs, their eyes wide and fixed on the shimmering blue water behind me like it was the promised land. "Mr. Davies," Carol chirped, a smile plastered on her face that didn't quite reach her eyes. It was the kind of smile a shark might offer just before taking a bite. Such a lovely day, isn't it? Terribly hot for the little ones. She gestured towards her offspring, who were now practically vibrating with anticipation. They were just saying how wonderful it would be to cool off in the pool. Notice the emphasis on the, not your pool, but the pool, as if it were a public utility she had every right to access. My internal alarm bells, previously tinkling, were now clanging like a 5-alarm fire drill. This was going to require careful handling. I offered what I hoped was a neutral, slightly apologetic expression. "It is a hot one, Mrs. McMillan," I agreed. "And yes, the pool is nice." I paused, then delivered the crucial next line. "However, this is a private pool, on my private property. I'm afraid it's not open for general use." I tried to keep my tone light, regretful even, as if I genuinely wished circumstances were different. The smile on Carol's face faltered, then vanished, replaced by a look of mild confusion, quickly hardening into a front. "Oh," she said, her voice losing its saccharine edge. "Well, I'm sure you wouldn't mind if just the children popped in for a quick dip. They're very well behaved." She gave her son a little nudge forward, as if to demonstrate his impeccable manners. He just stared at the water, drool practically forming at the corner of his mouth. "I appreciate that, Mrs. McMillan," I said, my politeness now bordering on strain. "But for liability reasons, and frankly, for my own privacy and enjoyment of my property, I don't allow guests I haven't personally invited to use the pool. I'm sure you understand." I was hoping the liability angle would resonate with an HOA president, a figure presumably concerned with rules and regulations. It did not. Her eyes narrowed. "Liability? Mr. Davies, I am the president of the Oakhaven Estates Homeowners Association. I think I understand liability." The implication was clear. Her status somehow negated any concerns I might have. "And as such," she continued, her voice rising in volume and indignation, "I can assure you that it's perfectly acceptable. In fact, in a community like Oakhaven, sharing resources like this is encouraged. It fosters a sense of community." My jaw tightened. "Sharing community resources, yes," I countered, trying to keep my voice even. "This, however, is not a community resource. It's my private pool on my land, maintained at my expense, and insured under my homeowner's policy, which, by the way, has specific clauses about uninvited guests." I was already mentally reviewing my policy details. A habit from my line of work. Always know the rules. Always have your facts straight. Carol puffed up like an agitated pufferfish. The floral caftan seemed to expand with her indignation. "Are you seriously telling me," she enunciated each word with glacial precision, "that you are denying my children, on this incredibly hot day, a simple swim in a pool that is, for all intents and purposes, part of this community's aesthetic and appeal?" Her logic was so breathtakingly audacious, it almost left me speechless. "Part of the community's aesthetic?" I repeated, a touch of incredulity creeping into my voice despite my best efforts. "Mrs. McMillan, my pool is in my backyard, behind a 6-foot privacy fence. Its aesthetic contribution to the community is negligible at best, and certainly doesn't grant public access rights." The children were starting to look mutinous. Sensing their hopes of a swim were rapidly evaporating, the little girl let out a distinct, theatrical whimper. Carol shot her a look, then turned back to me, her face a mask of outrage. "This is utterly unreasonable, Mr. Davies. I have never encountered such selfishness in Oakhaven. What kind of neighbor are you?" It was then I made a small, almost imperceptible movement, casually shifting my weight so that my hand was closer to the pocket of my swim trunks where my phone rested. I hadn't started recording yet. I generally prefer to de-escalate if possible. But her escalating rhetoric was setting off all sorts of internal warnings. My professional training always emphasized documenting interactions, especially when individuals become irrational or accusatory. "I'm the kind of neighbor who values my privacy and property rights, Mrs. McMillan," I stated calmly, "just as I respect yours." This apparently was the wrong thing to say. "Property rights?" She scoffed. her voice now loud enough to attract the attention of Mrs. Henderson, who I could just see peeking through her curtains across the street. "We live in an HOA. There are expectations. There are standards of neighborly conduct. This is bordering on hostile." "Hostile?" I asked, raising an eyebrow. "Refusing to allow uninvited, unsupervised children into a private swimming pool is hostile? I think most people would call that responsible." The little boy, emboldened by his mother's aggression, suddenly piped up, "But we want to swim. It's hot. Mommy, make him let us swim." Carol patted his head, her eyes still blazing at me. "Don't you worry, sweetie. Mommy will handle this." She turned back to me, her expression hardening into something akin to a declaration of war. "Mr. Davies, I am going to be very clear. Either you allow my children to cool off in that pool for half an hour, or I will be forced to take this matter further. I will call an emergency meeting of the HOA board. I will report your uncooperative and frankly antisocial behavior." The absurdity of it was almost comical, but her conviction was genuinely unnerving. She truly believed she was in the right. "You are, of course, free to call whomever you wish, Mrs. McMillan," I said, my patience wearing dangerously thin. "But my answer regarding the pool remains no. It's not happening." I started to gently close the gate. Carol's hand shot out and slammed against it, pushing it back open. "Oh, no, you don't," she snarled, her face contorted. "You are not just dismissing me like this. I am the HOA president. My children are suffering in this heat because of your pig-headedness." At this point, I subtly pressed the record button on my phone, which was now in my hand, held casually at my side. The angle wouldn't be perfect, but the audio would be crystal clear. "Mrs. McMillan," I said, my voice deliberately low and measured, "you are currently trespassing. You've pushed open my gate after I attempted to close it. I'm asking you politely, one last time, to please leave my property." Her eyes widened, not with fear, but with a fresh wave of indignation. "Trespassing? I am conducting HOA business. I am trying to resolve a community issue caused by your blatant disregard for your neighbors." "There is no community issue here, other than the one you're creating," I replied, my gaze steady. "This is private property, and you are unwelcome." That was it. That was the spark that lit the fuse. Carol McMillan's face turned a rather alarming shade of puce, ironically the very color she probably forbade residents from painting their houses. Her chest heaved. "Right!" she shrieked, whipping out her own phone, a large, garish model with a diamante-encrusted case. "That's it! I've had enough of your obstruction. You want to play hardball, Mr. Davies? We'll play hardball. I'm calling the police. I'm calling 911. They'll sort you out. They'll see who's being hostile and unreasonable." And with that, her fingers, adorned with several chunky rings, began furiously stabbing at her screen. My mind raced. She was actually doing it. She was calling 911 because I wouldn't let her kids use my private pool. The sheer, unadulterated entitlement was staggering. I could only imagine the report she was concocting. "Yes, 911? I need an officer immediately. There's a man here. He's threatening. He's denying access to a vital community resource. Children are in distress due to the heat. He's being very aggressive." Her voice was a symphony of feigned panic and righteous outrage, a truly Oscar-worthy performance for an audience of one, me, and, unbeknownst to her, my silently recording phone. The two kids, startled by their mother's sudden escalation, had gone quiet, their earlier desire for a swim now seemingly replaced by a dawning unease. They just stood there, eyes wide, watching the drama unfold. I simply stood my ground. Inside my gate, my expression, I imagine, a mixture of disbelief and a rather grim sort of anticipation. This was, I thought, going to be a very interesting afternoon. The suburban warfare, Mr. Henderson had hinted at, had just been declared, and the opening salvo was a 911 call based on pure, unadulterated Karen logic. I wondered, briefly, if my colleagues at the precinct had a betting pool for the most ridiculous call of the day. If so, this one was definitely in the running for the grand prize. The wait for the cavalry, or in this case, my colleagues from the local police department, was both excruciatingly long and surprisingly short. Carol McMillan paced back and forth on the sidewalk in front of my house, her floral caftan billowing dramatically with each agitated turn, phone still pressed to her ear, as if awaiting further instructions from a higher power, or perhaps just relishing the imagined vindication that was surely speeding its way towards her. Her children, Timmy and Tiffany, or whatever their names were, had wilted considerably. The initial excitement of a potential swim, followed by the confusing drama of their mother's meltdown, had given way to a kind of bored resignation. They slumped onto the curb, listlessly poking at an anthill with a stick, occasionally casting wary glances towards me, still standing just inside my pool gate, a silent sentinel of my aquatic sovereignty. I, on the other hand, was using the time to mentally prepare. My own phone was still recording, tucked safely back into my pocket. I ran through the relevant city ordinances and state statutes in my head: misuse of emergency services, false reporting, trespassing. I wasn't looking to escalate things further myself, but if Carol had decided to throw the legal handbook at me, she was about to find out I had read it cover to cover and probably written a few chapters. I could see Mr. Henderson now, openly watching from his porch, a small, knowing smile playing on his lips. Mrs. Albright, however, was nowhere to be seen. Perhaps the guilt of her unwitting instigation had driven her indoors. A few other neighbors were beginning to make furtive appearances, peeking through blinds or loitering casually by their mailboxes, drawn by the undeniable magnetism of a brewing suburban skirmish. The air was thick with unspoken questions and the faint, sweet smell of Carol's aggressive perfume, which seemed to have declared war on the natural scent of blooming gardenias from my neighbor's yard. Finally, the distant but unmistakable sound of a siren grew closer, culminating in the arrival of a patrol car, lights silently flashing as it pulled up to the curb. 2 officers emerged, a man and a woman, both looking professional, if a little weary. It was a hot day, after all, and I knew from experience that tempers frayed easily in the summer heat. This was probably not the first less-than-critical call they'd attended. Carol practically flew towards them, her caftan now resembling a frantic, oversized butterfly. "Officers, thank goodness you're here," she gushed, her voice dripping with relief and a carefully curated victimhood. "This man," she pointed an accusatory, diamond-laden finger directly at me, "has been completely unreasonable. He's denying my children, my poor, overheated children, access to the community pool. He's become aggressive and threatening, and frankly, I'm concerned for our safety." I noted the subtle upgrade from the pool to the community pool, and the addition of aggressive and threatening. Standard escalation tactics for someone trying to justify a questionable 911. Oh. Officer Miller, the male officer, a tall, sturdily built man, with a calm demeanor I recognized from a few departmental briefings, turned his gaze towards me. Officer Davies, no relation, just an unfortunate coincidence of surnames that sometimes caused confusion at the station. His partner, a younger woman with sharp, intelligent eyes, was already taking in the scene, her expression neutral. "Sir," Officer Miller began, his voice polite but firm, "can you tell us what's going on here?" Before I could utter a word, Carol interjected. "He won't let us use the pool. It's right there, part of Oakhaven Estates. We pay our HOA dues. He has no right." She was practically bouncing with indignation. I took a slow, deliberate breath. "Officers," I began, my voice calm and steady. "My name is John Davies. This is my private residence." I gestured to the house behind me. "That is my private swimming pool, located on my private property, behind a locked gate and a privacy fence." I paused, letting that sink in. "Mrs. McMillan here, who I understand is the HOA president, approached my gate demanding that her children be allowed to use my pool. I politely declined, citing liability concerns and my right to privacy. She then became agitated, refused to leave my property when asked, and when I attempted to close my gate, she physically prevented me from doing so. Officer Davies, the female officer, was now jotting notes in a small pad. Officer Miller looked from me to Carol, then back to me. So, this is your personal pool, not a community pool? He asked, a hint of skepticism in his voice, likely due to Carol's insistent claims. Absolutely, I confirmed. I have the deed to the property. The pool was here when I bought the house. It's maintained solely at my expense, and it is most certainly not a community amenity. My HOA documents, which Mrs. Macmillan, as president, should be intimately familiar with, clearly delineate common areas, and my backyard is not among them, Carol sputtered. But it's Oakhaven. We're a community. People share. He's being deliberately obstructive. He even admitted it was part of the community aesthetic. This was a blatant misrepresentation of my earlier, sarcastic repetition of her own absurd words. I resisted the urge to roll my eyes. Ma'am, Officer Davies interjected, her voice calm but authoritative, addressing Carol. Did you call 911 because this gentleman wouldn't let your children swim in his private pool? Carol drew herself up. Yes, of course, it's an emergency. My children are suffering in this heat. He was being hostile. I felt threatened, she insisted, a quaver in her voice that sounded remarkably rehearsed. Officer Miller sighed, a very subtle, almost imperceptible exhalation, but one I recognized. It was the sigh of an officer dealing with a call that was rapidly devolving into a he said, she said, over something utterly trivial, yet consuming valuable time and resources. Sir, he said to me, did you threaten this woman in any way? Absolutely not, officer, I replied firmly. I informed her that she was trespassing when she refused to leave my property line and physically held my gate open. My tone was firm, but not threatening. In fact, I added, glancing at Carol, I have a recording of the entire interaction, should it be necessary to clarify any misstatements. Carol's eyes widened almost imperceptibly. The mention of a recording seemed to deflate her righteous indignation by a few crucial psi. Her bluster faltered for a microsecond. Officer Miller's eyebrows rose a fraction. You have a recording? This was getting interesting for them too now. Just as I was about to elaborate, a familiar, official-sounding chirp emanated from my pocket. It wasn't my personal cell. It was my department-issued work phone. I'd forgotten it was in the pocket of my swim trunks, a habit born of years of being on call. The timing was, to put it mildly, impeccable. All four of us, me, Carol, Officer Miller, and Officer Davies, froze for a beat. The chirping continued, insistent. With a slight grimace of apology to the two officers, I said, Excuse me, I should probably get that. It's work. I reached into my pocket and pulled out the unmistakable, ruggedized black phone, the one with the City Police Department logo faintly visible on the back. I glanced at the caller ID. It was Sergeant Miller from dispatch, probably calling about a shift change or some other routine matter, but the effect on the current audience was electric. Officer Miller and Officer Davies both stared at the phone, then at me, then back at the phone. Recognition dawned in their eyes. Officer Davies' mouth quirked slightly. Carol Macmillan, however, looked utterly bewildered, her jaw slack. The aggressive certainty that had animated her moments before was rapidly draining away, replaced by a dawning, horrified confusion. She stared at the phone in my hand as if it were an alien artifact. I pressed the answer button. Officer Davies speaking, I said, my voice clear and professional, the standard greeting I used a dozen times a day. The silence that followed was profound, broken only by the distant hum of a lawnmower and the chirping of the cicadas, now sounding like a stunned audience. Officer Miller let out a slow breath. Officer Davies subtly lowered her notepad. Carol Macmillan's face, which had cycled through various shades of red and puce, now went a startling, chalky white. Her eyes, wide and unblinking, were fixed on me, or rather, on the police-issued phone I held to my ear. The smoking gun had just gone off, and the bullet was pure, unadulterated irony. The transformation in Carol Macmillan's demeanor was instantaneous and profound. One moment she was the aggrieved victim, the self-appointed guardian of community standards, fearlessly battling the curmudgeonly recluse who dared deny her children their God-given right to swim. The next, As the words, "Officer Davies speaking," echoed in the sudden stillness, she looked like a startled deer caught in the high beams of an oncoming 18-wheeler. An 18-wheeler, driven by the very authority she had so confidently summoned. Her mouth opened and closed a few times, producing no sound, like a goldfish gasping for air. The floral kaftan seemed to shrink around her, its vibrant colors suddenly looking garish and out of place against her ashen complexion. Officer Miller, my colleague on the scene, exchanged a quick, almost imperceptible glance with Officer Davies, his partner. There was a flicker of something in Miller's eyes. Surprise, certainly, but also a dawning understanding, perhaps even a touch of weary amusement. This call had just taken a very unexpected detour from the mundane. "Sergeant Miller." "Yes, it's Davies," I said into my work phone, maintaining my professional tone while keenly aware of the tableau frozen before me. "No, everything's, well, relatively under control here at my residence. Just a minor misunderstanding being sorted out. Yes, I'll be in for my shift later. Thanks." I ended the call and slipped the phone back into my pocket. The silence stretched for another beat, thick and heavy. Then Officer Miller cleared his throat. "So," he began, his voice carefully neutral but with an underlying current I couldn't quite decipher yet. Was it exasperation or professional courtesy? "You're Officer John Davies? From our precinct?" "The very same," I confirmed, offering a small apologetic smile. "Sorry for the unorthodox introduction. I'm off duty today, obviously." I gestured to my swim trunks and bare feet. "Just trying to enjoy a quiet day at home." Carol finally found her voice, though it was a mere squeak compared to her earlier bellowing. You're a police officer?" she stammered, her eyes darting between me and the two uniformed officers, as if trying to reconcile two completely incompatible realities. "But you didn't say anything." "It didn't seem relevant, Mrs. McMillan," I replied calmly, "until you decided to call 911 and make accusations of aggressive behavior and implied threats, and claim my private property was a community resource in an attempt to leverage police intervention for what amounts to a personal convenience for your children." I turned to Officers Miller and Davies. As I mentioned, I have an audio recording of the entire interaction from the moment Mrs. McMillan began making demands at my gate, through her refusal to leave, her physically preventing me from closing my gate, and her subsequent decision to call emergency services under false pretenses. Officer Davies raised an eyebrow. "False pretenses, Officer Davies?" she asked, the professional address now feeling slightly surreal given the circumstances. "Please elaborate." "Certainly," I said, now fully in my professional element, albeit in swimwear. "Mrs. McMillan, or Karen, as I believe she's known colloquially in some circles," a small, almost invisible smile touched Officer Miller's lips at that, "contacted 911, claiming an immediate need for police assistance due to a hostile individual, myself, denying access to a community resource and making her feel threatened. She also implied my children were in distress due to the heat, suggesting an urgent welfare concern. The truth, as the recording will attest, is that I politely but firmly refused to allow her uninvited children access to my private swimming pool. There were no threats made by me, no aggression on my part. The only aggression exhibited was when Mrs. Pride McMillan physically prevented me from securing my property and then escalated by misusing the 911 system when she didn't get her way. Carol began to sputter again. I didn't. It felt threatening. He was being so uncooperative, and the children are hot." "Ma'am," Officer Miller said, his tone now distinctly firmer, all traces of weary amusement gone, replaced by a no-nonsense professionalism. "Misusing the 911 emergency system is a serious offense. It ties up resources that might be needed for genuine emergencies. Making a false police report is also a serious offense." He paused, letting his words sink in. "Officer Davies," he addressed me, "you're alleging that Mrs. McMillan knowingly provided false information to the 911 operator and to us upon our arrival?" "That is precisely what I'm alleging, Officer Miller," I confirmed. and I have the evidence to support it. She clearly stated her intent was to have you sort me out because I wouldn't acquiesce to her demands regarding my private property." Carol looked like she was about to faint. Her bravado had completely evaporated, leaving behind a quivering wreck. The two children, sensing the dramatic shift in power dynamics, had sidled up to their mother and were now clinging to her caftan, their faces pale and anxious. They clearly understood, on some level, that Mommy was in big trouble. "Now wait just a minute." Carol finally managed, her voice shrill and panicky. "This is a misunderstanding, a complete misunderstanding. I was just concerned for my children. Any mother would be." Concern for your children doesn't give you the right to trespass, attempt to bully a homeowner, and then file a false police report when you don't get your way, Mrs. McMillan, I stated evenly. And it certainly doesn't justify wasting police resources on a non-emergency. Officer Davies spoke up, her gaze fixed on Carol. "Ma'am, we'll need to hear that recording, Officer Davies. And we'll also need to get a statement from the 911 dispatcher who took your call, Mrs. McMillan." She then turned to me. "Officer Davies, are you wishing to press charges for trespassing and for the false report?" This was the critical juncture. I looked at Carol McMillan, truly looked at her. The imperious HOA president was gone. In her place was a terrified woman, suddenly confronted with the very real consequences of her own arrogance and entitlement. Her eyes pleaded silently. For a fleeting second, a tiny part of me considered letting it go, just to be done with the whole ridiculous affair. But then I thought of the notices, the petty tyrannies, the sheer audacity of her actions, not just today, but her pattern of behavior that Mr. Henderson and others had alluded to. I thought about the waste of police time, the potential for a situation like this to escalate, if handled by someone less patient, or if I hadn't been who I was. And I thought about the clear message that needed to be sent, that such behavior was not acceptable. "Yes, Officer Davies," I said, my voice firm. "I am. Specifically for misuse of 911 and making a false report. The trespassing, while annoying, I might have let slide if it hadn't led to this." Carol let out a small, strangled gasp. "No, you can't. I'm the HOA president. This will ruin me." Officer Miller stepped forward. "Mrs. McMillan," he said, his voice devoid of sympathy, "based on the information provided by Officer Davies here, and your own admissions, we have probable cause to believe you have committed at least 2 offenses. Misuse of the 911 system, section, insert relevant local ordinance or state statute number here, and knowingly filing a false police report, section, insert another relevant code here. Both are misdemeanors, but they are arrestable offenses." He paused. "Given Officer Davies is the victim here, and also a sworn officer who witnessed the entirety of the offenses, it might be most appropriate." He trailed off, looking at me. I knew what he was implying. It was a slightly unusual situation, arresting someone when you're technically off duty and the initial complainant. But given I was the direct victim of the false report and the misuse of services directed at me, and had unimpeachable evidence, it wasn't unheard of, especially to streamline the process. "Mrs. Carol McMillan," I said, stepping fully out of my pool gate and onto the driveway, my bare feet surprisingly steady on the hot concrete. My voice was calm, professional, and carried the weight of the law I was sworn to uphold. "You are under arrest for misuse of emergency services and for making a false police report." Carol's face crumpled. "No, please, my children." "Your children will be taken care of, ma'am," Officer Davies said gently but firmly. "We can call their father or another responsible adult to come and get them." As I spoke the words of the arrest, I could see Mr. Henderson across the street actually give a small, discreet fist pump. The curtain twitched in another window down the street. The suburban telegraph was, no doubt, already buzzing. Carol began to cry. Not the theatrical tears of earlier, but genuine messy sobs of fear and humiliation. "This is a nightmare. This can't be happening." Officer Miller retrieved a pair of handcuffs from his belt. "Ma'am, please turn around and place your hands behind your back." Carol just stood there, frozen, tears streaming down her face, making her expensive makeup run in grotesque rivulets. Her children were now openly wailing. It wasn't a pretty sight, and I took no particular joy in her distress, but a profound sense of justice, long overdue, was definitely settling in. This wasn't just about a pool, it was about an abuse of power, however petty, and a fundamental lack of respect for others and for the law. She had played a foolish game and was now facing the entirely predictable, if to her, unthinkable consequences. The sound of the handcuffs clicking shut was surprisingly loud in the sudden afternoon quiet, a definitive punctuation mark on Carol McMillan's reign as the undisputed queen of Oakhaven Estates. The suburban warfare had reached its climax, and it was a takedown more swift and decisive than I could have ever orchestrated intentionally. Sometimes the universe, or in this case, an ill-advised 911 call, just delivers justice right to your doorstep, or, as it happened, to your pool gate. The immediate aftermath of Carol McMillan's arrest was a flurry of controlled, professional activity mixed with a distinctly suburban brand of gawking. Officer Davies, with a practiced gentleness that belied the firmness of the situation, began the process of trying to calm Carol's now hysterical children. Tiffany and Timmy, I'd finally caught their names amidst the chaos. She knelt to their level, speaking in soft, reassuring tones, while Officer Miller completed the cuffing and began reading Carol her Miranda rights. Carol, for her part, had sagged against the side of her Lexus SUV as if her bones had turned to jelly, the fight completely gone out of her, replaced by a stunned, tearful disbelief. Her expensive caftan looked rumpled and tragic. "You have the right to remain silent," Officer Miller recited, his voice a stark contrast to Carol's broken sobs. "Anything you say can and will be used against you in a court of law." Each phrase seemed to land like a physical blow on the now former HOA despot. Mr. Henderson had ambled over from his porch and was now standing at a respectful distance on the sidewalk, watching with an expression of quiet vindication. He caught my eye and gave a slow, deliberate nod, a gesture that spoke volumes. Other neighbors were less discreet. A small crowd had begun to gather at the end of my driveway, murmuring amongst themselves, their faces a mixture of shock, curiosity, and in some cases, poorly concealed glee. The news of the HOA president being arrested in her floral caftan, in front of the very house whose owner she'd tried to strong-arm, was clearly going to be the Oakhaven Estates legend for years to come. I retrieved my phone, the one with the crucial audio recording, and handed it to Officer Miller. "The recording is time-stamped from when she first approached my gate," I explained. "It should cover everything." He took it carefully. "We'll download this at the station, Davies. Standard procedure." He then glanced towards Carol. "We'll need to transport Mrs. McMillan and make arrangements for the children." Carol, overhearing this, let out a fresh wail. "My husband! Call my husband, Richard. He's at golf. He'll sort this out." Her faith in Richard's ability to sort out her arrest for actual crimes seemed as misplaced as her earlier faith in her HOA title to grant her dominion over my swimming pool. Officer Davies managed to get Richard McMillan's phone number from a distraught Carol and made the call. From what I could gather of the one-sided conversation, Richard was less than thrilled to be interrupted mid-round, and even less thrilled to hear his wife had been arrested. There was a long pause. Then Officer Davies said, "Yes, sir. I understand it's inconvenient, but your children need a responsible adult. Mrs. McMillan is being transported to the precinct for processing." Another pause. "Approximately 30 minutes. Thank you." She ended the call with a sigh. "Mr. McMillan is on his way." He sounded displeased. "I can only imagine," I murmured, a dry understatement. The next 20 minutes were spent waiting for Richard's arrival. Carol was placed in the back of the patrol car, a truly ignominious position for someone so accustomed to being in the driver's seat, both literally and figuratively. The sight of the Oakhaven HOA president, peerless leader of law and order and architectural conformity, peering out through the caged window of a police cruiser, was something no one present would soon forget. The children, now somewhat calmer thanks to Officer Davies' patient efforts and the promise of their father's imminent arrival, sat on the curb, looking small and bewildered. I felt a pang of sympathy for them. They were innocent pawns in their mother's entitlement drama. A sleek, black Mercedes sedan eventually screeched to a halt behind the patrol car. Richard McMillan emerged, looking like he'd just stepped off the 18th green at Augusta, dressed in expensive golf attire, his face a mask of thunderous disapproval. He was a portly man, with a florid complexion that suggested a fondness for fine dining and perhaps a temper to match his wife's. He didn't even glance at me. His entire focus was on the patrol car and then on his children. After a brief, terse conversation with Officer Miller, during which Richard's face seemed to get even redder, he curtly herded his subdued children into the Mercedes. He shot one venomous glare towards the back of the patrol car, then another towards me, a look that promised future, unspecified retribution, before roaring off down the street. "Charming fellow," Officer Miller commented dryly as the Mercedes disappeared. "Runs in the family, apparently," I replied. With the children accounted for, there was nothing left but the processing of the arrestee. "Davies," Officer Miller said, "you'll need to come down to the station later to give a formal statement and sign the complaint, even though you understood," I said. "I'll head down after I've had a chance to, actually use my pool." A small smile touched his lips. "Probably a good idea. You've earned it." They drove off with Carol McMillan in tow, leaving behind a suddenly quiet street, a gaggle of stunned neighbors, and me, standing in my driveway in my swim trunks, feeling a bizarre mixture of exhaustion and exhilaration. The suburban battlefield was clear, the vanquished foe removed. Mr. Henderson ambled over. "Well, son," he said, a broad grin spreading across his face, "I do believe you've just done this neighborhood a tremendous service. That woman was a menace. Just enforcing the law, Mr. Henderson," I said, though I couldn't suppress a returning smile, "even when I'm technically on vacation." "Indeed," he chuckled. "Indeed. Heard she tried to fine old Mrs. Gable for the color of her petunias last spring. Said they were non-compliant, vibrant hues." We shared a look of mutual understanding at the sheer absurdity of it all. The neighbors gradually dispersed, no doubt eager to spread the tale. I finally walked back through my pool gate, latched it firmly, and surveyed my hard-won sanctuary. The water shimmered invitingly. My towel was still on the lounger. The cicadas buzzed, unconcerned with human dramas. It was, once again, peaceful. Later that afternoon, after a long, uninterrupted, and deeply satisfying float in my pool, I drove down to the precinct. The atmosphere was interesting. News of the HOA President Pool arrest, as it was already being dubbed, had clearly preceded me. There were a few raised eyebrows, some knowing smirks, and a lot of questions, mostly along the lines of, "You did what?" Sergeant Miller, the one who had called my work phone, clapped me on the shoulder. "Davies, you magnificent bastard," he said, shaking his head in amusement. "Never a dull moment with you, even on your day off." I gave my statement. Signed the official complaint detailing Carol McMillan's transgressions. Misuse of 911, a violation of City Ordinance 9112, unlawful use of emergency telephone service, and making a false report to a peace officer, a violation of State Penal Code 748.5. The evidence, primarily my audio recording and the corroborating testimony from the 911 dispatcher, was ironclad. Carol, I learned, had been booked and processed. Richard had apparently posted her bail, which was relatively modest for misdemeanor charges, but the humiliation factor was, I suspected, off the charts. She'd spent a few uncomfortable hours in a holding cell, a far cry from her usual linen and Lexus lifestyle. The booking photo, I imagined, would be a classic. The drive home was quiet. The neighborhood seemed lighter, as if a collective sigh of relief had settled over Oakhaven Estates. I knew this wasn't entirely the end of it. There would be court dates, legal proceedings. But the immediate crisis was over. The bully had been faced down, not with aggression, but with calm, irrefutable facts. and the unexpected trump card of my profession. It was a stark reminder that sometimes the most effective way to deal with irrational entitlement is to simply let it run headlong into the firm, unyielding wall of the law. And, perhaps, to always keep your work phone handy, even when you're just trying to take a swim. The fallout from Carol McMillan's arrest was, to put it mildly, spectacular. Oak Haven Estates, usually a placid pond of suburban conformity, erupted into a veritable geyser of gossip, speculation, and thinly veiled celebration. My phone, my personal phone this time, started ringing with calls from neighbors I'd barely spoken to, all eager to offer their support, share their own Carol stories, or just get the salacious details firsthand. It seemed Mrs. McMillan's reign as HOA president had been less a benevolent dictatorship and more a petty tyranny, marked by arbitrary fines, nonsensical rule interpretations, and a general atmosphere of fear and resentment. My actions, it turned out, had inadvertently lanced a festering boil. An emergency HOA meeting was convened within a week, not by Carol, who was conspicuously absent, reportedly indisposed and seeking legal counsel, but by a coalition of long-suffering board members and outraged homeowners. Mr. Henderson, armed with a newfound vigor, was apparently instrumental in rallying the troops. The meeting, I was told by several gleeful attendees, was standing room only, held in the community clubhouse, a building Carol had lorded over as if it were her personal Versailles. The primary agenda item: a vote of no confidence in President Carol McMillan. The audio recording of her unhinged rant at my pool gate, which had somehow, and I plead complete ignorance as to how, made its way into wider circulation after being submitted as evidence, was played for all to hear. The gasps, the shocked silence, followed by righteous indignation, were apparently epic. The vote was overwhelmingly, almost unanimously, in favor of her immediate removal. Her few remaining enablers on the board, who had likely benefited from her rule or were simply too cowed to oppose her previously, either abstained or quietly voted with the majority, seeing the writing writ large on the clubhouse wall. Carol McMillan was officially deposed, her reign of error over. In her place, a steering committee was formed, tasked with electing a new, hopefully more reasonable board. Mr. Foundation Henderson, to my surprise and delight, was nominated and accepted a position on this interim committee, promising a return to common sense and neighborly respect. The legal proceedings against Carol took a few months to wind their way through the local court system. She hired a high-powered, expensive-looking lawyer who initially tried to argue that the whole thing was a misunderstanding, that Carol was merely a passionate community leader who had perhaps been overzealous in her concern for children's welfare. This defense crumbled pretty quickly when faced with the crystal-clear audio recording of her threats, her false statements to the 911 operator, whose testimony was damning, and my own testimony as both victim and arresting officer, a slightly unusual, but legally sound, position in this specific context. Her lawyer, seeing the writing on the wall, eventually advised her to plead no contest to the charge of misuse of emergency services. The false report charge was held in abeyance, contingent on her successful completion of probation and a mandated anger management course. She received a hefty fine, a period of probation, and, perhaps most galling for her, was ordered to write a formal letter of apology to me and to the police department for wasting their time and resources. I received said letter a few weeks later. It was a masterpiece of reluctant contrition, clearly drafted by her lawyer, admitting errors in judgment and regret for any distress caused, without actually taking full responsibility in the way a truly repentant person might. Still, it was a tangible symbol of her defeat. I framed it and briefly considered hanging it in my bathroom, but decided that was perhaps a step too far into gloating. It resides in a file now, a memento of a truly bizarre summer. The impact on the neighborhood was palpable. The oppressive cloud of HOA overreach lifted. People started planting non-compliant petunias with abandon. Bird feeders reappeared. There was a rumor that someone even dared to leave their trash cans an extra inch from the curb, just because they could. The new interim HOA board, with Mr. W. HOA board Henderson playing a key role, began a systematic review of the existing covenants, vowing to eliminate the more ridiculous and arbitrarily enforced rules. There was a sense of liberation, of a community taking back control from an autocrat. As for me, life returned to its previous, more peaceful rhythm. My pool remained my private sanctuary, undisturbed by further demands for unscheduled aquatic recreation. Neighbors waved, not with furtive apprehension, but with genuine friendliness. Some even dropped off baked goods as a thank you. Mrs. Albright, my chatty neighbor who had inadvertently set the whole thing in motion by mentioning my pool, sent over an enormous zucchini bread with a note profusely apologizing for her loose lips. I assured her all was forgiven. Carol and Richard McMillan put their house on the market shortly after the court case concluded. It sold surprisingly quickly. I can't say I was sorry to see them go. The new owners, a young couple with a friendly golden retriever, seemed blissfully unaware of the drama that had unfolded just a few months prior. They just liked the house and the quiet street. The only lingering reminder of the incident, aside from the framed letter of apology tucked away in my files, was the occasional knowing wink from Mr. Henderson, or the way some of the old-timers would refer to my pool as Freedom Plunge. It became a local legend, a cautionary tale about what happens when unchecked entitlement meets immovable resolve, with a healthy dose of legal consequence thrown in. Looking back, it's still surreal. I set out that July morning simply wanting to enjoy a swim, and ended up dismantling a petty dictatorship, armed with little more than a privacy fence, a cell phone, and a working knowledge of the penal code. It taught me that while my profession often deals with the darker sides of human nature, sometimes it also provides the tools to deal with the more absurdly inflated egos. It also reinforced my belief in the sanctity of one's own backyard. So, what's the craziest encounter you've ever had with an HOA or an entitled neighbor? Drop a comment below. I'd love to hear your stories. Misery, or in this case, triumph, loves company. And if you enjoyed this tale of suburban justice, make sure to hit that like button and subscribe for more, because trust me, in my line of work, the stories just keep coming. You never know when the next seemingly ordinary day will turn into something you'll be recounting for years.